Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jay Wong. I'm a professor at the USC Annenberg School for Communication Journalism and the director of the USC Center on Public Diplomacy, and I am an immigrant. It is my great pleasure to welcome all of you to this very special program on the future of city diplomacy. As we all know, cities are increasingly poised and indeed being called upon to play a greater role in addressing challenges at the international level. What U.S. cities should be doing on the world stage and how is the topic of today's discussion. This program is presented by the USC Center on Public Diplomacy and the Los Angeles Mayor's Office of International Affairs in partnership with New York City Office of International Affairs. We'd like to thank Mr. and Mrs. Robert and Mimi Liu, the Qatar Media Corporation, and the Consulate of Qatar in Los Angeles for their generous support to make this program possible. Thank you. To help us unpack the most critical issues in city diplomacy, we have with us today a very distinguished panel, which I will introduce in a minute. We'll leave plenty of time for conversation and discussion with the audience. And the event is live streamed via Facebook Live, and we have a special hashtag, CPD City Diplomacy. And we look forward to a stimulating and enriching discussion both here in the auditorium and also online. And I also see quite a few friends, if I may also call you the fans of CPD today in the audience, and we appreciate your support and thank you for the support as the Center enters its 15th year in advancing the study and practice of public diplomacy through our research analysis, public engagement, and professional training. I'd like to invite one of our fans to come to the stage to give welcome remarks. Would you please welcome Willow Bay, Walter H. Annenberg Chair in Communication and the Dean of the Annenberg School for Communication Journalism at the University of Southern California.
So thank you all and welcome on behalf of USC Annenberg. It is great to see you all here on campus, and welcome also to those of you who are joining us via live stream. A special thanks to the LA Mayor's Office for hosting this event, and fantastic to have the New York City Mayor's Office here as well, and good to get you back on campus. Jay, I really need to acknowledge Professor Wong, the director of CPD, and your outstanding staff. Thank you for the extraordinary work that you do and for bringing together this gathering today, an impressive group of guests, not just from LA and New York, but from 18 cities around the country, from Atlanta to Seattle, to discuss the opportunities that we have here at the city level to influence global dialogues and affect positive change. Increasingly, as I think you all know, I think I'm preaching to the converted, cities and local government are where we look as citizens to get things done. From climate change and immigration, health and security, data transparency and accountability, we call upon our city leaders not just to play a role locally, but nationally and, in fact, globally. U.S. cities now have an opportunity to use their resources and their expertise to influence discourse and policy in the international arena on issues that used to be solely under the purview of their municipalities or the state. You here in this room today, community leaders, each and every one of you, reflect the growing importance of megacities and city diplomacy. So as we think and act locally on global challenges, it's really important that we do things like this, that we create new opportunities for conversation, for dialogue, and debate between and among cities, so that together we can tackle the critical challenges that are shaping the future of our communities, shaping the future of our world. Fortunately, we know how to do that right here. USC Annenberg enjoys its very privileged role as a center for inquiry and dialogue amongst scholars and professionals whose groundbreaking and newsworthy research engage policymakers, industry leaders, influencers in the issues that are at the forefront of communication, at the forefront of global discourse. So it's fitting that we're also situated here in Los Angeles, where our own mayor so evocatively describes Los Angeles and describes our mission. As our city, as our mayor says, that reflects what the world looks like today and what America will look like tomorrow. A city who, as we all know, whose rich complexity offers us a unique ability and perspective to influence. Because as Mayor Garcetti also said, Jay, in an interview with CPD, in this new century, LA will be where the world looks for inspiration, new ideas, and strong leadership that redefines how people everywhere can work, grow, and prosper together. So let's together embrace this vision to guide our work, the work of today's panel and this entire rich day of sessions, to craft an effective policy strategy and global engagement agenda, and to build the skills and capacity required for the emergent and increasingly important role of city diplomacy. Together, we can amplify our voices and truly impact events on the world stage. So thank you for joining USC Center for Public Diplomacy today. I'm looking forward to sitting in the front row and enjoying today's panel and what I know will be an inspiring conversation about the future of city diplomacy that extends well beyond the power of this day. So thank you all.
Willow, thank you very much. Especially thank you for mentioning all the cities that I represented here. So for some of you may not know this. So this event, this public event, is part of the Los Angeles Summit on City Diplomacy that we are hosting along with the mayor's office today on campus. And we have cities across the country here. Maybe what I'll do is I'll just call the city as name, and our city official or representative, could you just stand and see that? Just let the rest of us see that who's here, what cities are represented here. Is that okay? Atlanta, yes, okay. Austin, Texas, Birmingham, Boston. Maybe you should all stand and then we can, please all stand, okay. Charlotte, North Carolina, Denver, Houston, New York City, Newark, Oakland, Philadelphia, San Antonio, San Diego, San Francisco, Seattle, and the very special Silicon Valley Office of Protocol, and last but not least, Los Angeles. Thank you all so much for joining us, and round of applause for the energy, the efforts all of our city officials and city leaders put into on a daily basis to further America's engagement with the world. Thank you very much. Now, I'd like to introduce our panelists. Panelists, please come to the stage as I call your name. First is Nina Hachigian, Deputy Mayor of International Affairs, City of Los Angeles, former U.S. Ambassador to the Association of Southeast Asian Nations from 2014 to 2017. Nina, thank you. Commissioner for International Affairs, New York City Office of International Affairs, an entrepreneur, and has worked in both development and programmatic areas for Human Rights Watch and the Clinton Global Initiative, and most importantly, a very proud Trojan. Yes. Welcome back to campus. Dr. Jaana Remes, an economist and a partner at the McKinsey Global Institute. Jaana leads McKinsey Global Institute's Urban World Research Series that has examined the shifting global power of cities, the rising urban consumer class, and the shifting global urban demographics, as well as the patterns of urban growth and renewal. Thank you for joining us, Jaana. And let me just flip this. Last but not least is Anthony Pipa. Tony is a senior fellow in the Global Economy and Development Program at the Brookings Institution. He served as the Chief Strategy Officer for USAID and as a U.S. Special Coordinator for the post-2015 agenda at the Department of State, leading the U.S. delegation at the UN to negotiate and adopt SDGs. Welcome, all the panelists. Let me get to my seat.
Thank you, Jay, and thank you to USC and to your center in particular for putting on this conference. I've learned a lot already from all the city representatives who are here, mostly about things I haven't yet accomplished in the 7 months that our office has existed. But why don't I begin with a quote from Mayor Garcetti. And he said this at his second State of the Global City address, which he gave a couple of weeks ago. He said, unlike what we hear from Washington these days, there is no dichotomy between patriotism on the one hand and global purpose on the other. Just as America can lead the world for common good and deliver for its people, so can LA be a global city and do well for ourselves. And he went on to say that, in fact, these two ends, being a global city and doing well for our people, reinforce one another. And that is, in a nutshell, why the mayor created this Office of International Affairs and why he appointed me to be deputy mayor. We seek to bring value to LA from our growing international ties, and we seek to do our part to improve the world by sharing our knowledge and our experiences and our values with other cities around the world and with other countries and other foreign partners. And his move is part of what has been a growing trend, you could say for thousands of years, for cities taking on international diplomacy. And by 2050, 2/3 of us around the world are going to be living in cities. So it makes a lot of sense. As for LA, we are a global city by just about any measure. In terms of our residents, we're just under 40% foreign-born, so our very people represent the globe. And as the mayor likes to say, you can see the world on the streets of Los Angeles, which is very true. Los Angeles County, for example, has the second largest populations of Mexicans outside of Mexico City, and the largest concentrations of 37 ethnic populations in the United States, including Koreans, Armenians, Chinese, Iranians, and many others. We've counted 120 dedicated foreign language media outlets that serve communities in Los Angeles, and I bet there's more than that, but there are, for example, 8 newspapers that serve the Thai community in LA. Economically, we're of course, tied to the world as well. We have the largest, busiest port complex in the Western Hemisphere. Our airport is the 4th busiest in the world, and both of them broke records last year for the number of goods and people moved. And we were lucky that foreign tourism actually increased last year in Los Angeles, where it dropped for the rest of the United States. Foreign businesses create hundreds of thousands of jobs every year in LA County, and we have many industries based here that are very global in nature. Of course, the entertainment industry, gaming, tech, sports, engineering and design, and many others. We've had a great run of international cultural events. We have King Tut here now from Egypt, and we just finished up PST's LA, which featured Latino art and Latin American art across the city. And we managed to land last year what the mayor calls the largest cultural and athletic prize a city can win in the world when we got the 2028 Olympics. So we'll be hosting that for the 3rd time. So the key question for my office is this: how can we use all these global connections and a mayor who has a global vision and actually has taught international relations to bring opportunities to Angelenos and to do our part to improve the world? And so we have 3 streams of work in our office, and I'll just go through them quickly. The first is trade and investment, so that's helping companies here export and also attracting foreign investment to our city. We want to help create good jobs and other kinds of economic opportunities. The Wilshire Grand downtown is one example of that. It's owned by Korean Airlines. So that's trade and investment. Then we have an Office of Policy and Protocol and International Relations. So we host high-profile foreign visitors, work closely with our wonderful consular corps, some of whom are here today, over 100 nations strong, and work to create the next generation of global Angelinos by working with LAUSD and our consulate corps. We have a few initiatives in the works that we are beginning to test, and we think I'm very excited about those. We host a lot of foreign delegations who are interested in learning about how we do things in Los Angeles, and we in turn are learning from them. We support a number of global networks that we're part of, the C40 being the most prominent, I think, in climate, but there's also 100 resilient cities. And recently, our chief resilience officer was in Mexico City with her counterpart. We want to learn from them how they are rolling out their early earthquake warning system, because we're going to do that here in LA. They want to learn from us about how our water pipes are seismically resistant. So that's the kind of exchanges that are happening all the time. And third, and definitely not least, is our Office of Olympic and Paralympic Development, and which also tracks LA's progress toward the Sustainable Development Goals. And Tony can talk more about that, but I encourage the cities that are here to think about that. It's a great way to track how you're doing and have a common language with the rest of the world. And I'm sure Tony will talk to us a little bit more about what those are all about, but it's been a terrific experience for us. So why don't I just end there?
Okay. Thanks.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. And it's very, it's fun to be back here as a grown-up. So I am the Commissioner for International Affairs for the City of New York. And while Nina's office is 7 months old, the Mayor's Office for International Affairs, it's had a few different names, but the agency is essentially over 50 years old. New York City is host to the largest diplomatic corps in the world. We have the UN headquarters, 193 permanent missions, 115 consulates, and about 70 plus trade missions. And so when Mayor de Blasio, who's also an internationalist, he and I actually went different years to the same grad program at Columbia in International Affairs. When he appointed me back in 2014, we had a conversation about ensuring that New York City creates a global platform from which we can promote what's working in New York City, but also better engage our diplomatic community with New York City, with the 5 boroughs in which they live. And so that has manifested in a number of different ways, but I think the most important thing that we did early on was restructure the office. There are operational goals that we are tasked with ensuring work well, everything from the parking program to diplomatic incidents and security issues. But really, there was such an opportunity. We have this extraordinary cultural and educational institution within the UN, but we also have the significant consular corps that really is an important bridge to our immigrant communities. Similar to LA, New York City, at 8.6 million residents, 1 in 3 are foreign born, and over 800 languages are spoken in New York City. So again, the world is in our streets and in our 5 boroughs. And what we've done over the last couple of years in terms of in building this relationship and really engaging the city diplomacy has been in a few ways. And Tony and I have recently met, but we have been doing similar work, I think parallel, these last couple of years. In 2015, the global community came together around the Sustainable Development Goals. It was the same year that Mayor de Blasio released One NYC, which is our development agenda for New York City. And because of our strong equity lens, we have our equity lens in sustainability and resiliency. There were synergies with all of the global goals that the UN was coming to an understanding and around in September 2014. And because of the synergy, we were able to launch a program called Global Vision Urban Action. And at the end of the day, this is really when cities and communities start to show up. That is great that governments came together around their important priorities in terms of addressing inequality around the world, but the action is going to have to happen at the community level, and that's what New York City was doing. So our Global Vision Urban Action program is actively sharing best practices with our UN and other international experts and bringing city leadership into that conversation. We also, around the same time, launched a program called Junior Ambassadors, and this is really to ensure and get at the heart of how do you get everyday New Yorkers to value this important diplomatic community that's working around issues related to global goals. And we knew it was about engaging young people in the conversation. And while the participants in this program learn about the different SDGs and meet with diplomats, their final project is about doing something in their community. So we are essentially activating the next generation of city diplomats and global leaders. And so that has been a really important component of my office. The other piece, and I've talked to many of my colleagues here today, we all have rich consular corps, and the consular community has been such an important ability to do outreach to our immigrant community. So it has been very important, and I will say that the last year, our federal government, as they have stepped back related to responsibilities related to global issues, including the Global Compact on Migration, New York City took the lead in terms of bringing together global cities around how we're going to participate in this conversation. But really, how do we work with our consular corps then to ensure that our services that we're providing New Yorkers are being essentially communicated to everyone throughout the 5 boroughs. So it's been an interesting mix of finding opportunity in this time of national government stepping back and city leadership stepping in. I will stop right there.
Thank you, Penny. Yes, Tony, please.
Thanks. So how many of you are familiar with the Sustainable Development Goals? All right, USC rocks. I will admit that's as about as good a showing of hands that I've seen in the United States, which is great to see. And so both Penny and Nina have talked a little bit about the SDGs. I led the U.S. delegation at the UN to negotiate and adopt the Sustainable Development Goals. And so if you think of the world leaders, heads of state, standing up in front of each other at the UN and committing to an agenda that is focused on ending poverty, tackling inequality, ensuring environmental sustainability, and tackling climate change, and saying this is what we owe our citizens as governments and as leaders, and agreeing to do that, that is what the Sustainable Development Goals really are about. They are a set of 17 goals, which really are interdependent, but they start with dimensions of human development. So ending poverty, ending extreme poverty, ending hunger, driving on many different dimensions of health and education, gender empowerment and equality, really from an economic perspective, as well as from a rights perspective, as well as dimensions of economic growth and inclusive economic growth, because that's what creates jobs and having decent work. And then at the same time, tackling climate change and ensuring environmental sustainability. And working on all those dimensions at one time. So if you think of the policy priorities that a city undertakes and even engages globally on, pretty much every one of those policy priorities is reflected in the Sustainable Development Goals. And these are goals. So these are outcome-based, time-bound. This is an agenda that is we're meant to achieve these by 2030 with a set of data and metrics to be able to measure progress. Now, these are very ambitious. It's a very ambitious set of goals. And so even when national governments and heads of state were signing up to it, they realized that the ambitions went beyond just the resources of their particular national governments. And it would require the leadership subnationally of cities, and it would also require other stakeholders, businesses, civil society, philanthropy, universities, to really engage and take a large role in this. Now, very interestingly, there is a goal on cities, on creating safe and sustainable cities. It is the only place-based goal, And frankly, during the negotiations, the United States started off in a position of not supporting a city's goal. And I heard from a lot of folks, one from a development perspective, and I think that's an interesting, so one thing that I think is interesting to note is that when we're talking about cities and then their global facing policy agenda and engagement, it's usually from a development perspective. It's about delivering for their citizens and how they can engage with other cities and other places across the world to ensure that they are really delivering for their citizens. And as we've already mentioned, cities play an outsized role and will continue to play a larger outsized role in development and in sustainable development globally. 2/3 of the population will live there by 2050. 80% of the world's GDP is in cities, 70% of greenhouse emissions come out of cities. And so from a development perspective, I was hearing from a lot of development advocates saying, we really need to recognize the importance of cities to a global development agenda, and there needs to be a goal. But I was also hearing from cities, because cities also recognized the importance of that agenda for themselves, as well as what it meant for their relationships with their national governments, actually. Because sometimes in the way in which policy is created, sometimes that policy at the national level is actually not city-friendly or doesn't really take into full account the issues that cities are undertaking. And so I think that's also an interesting thing to think about that the SDG provides. It really provides a recognition and an acknowledgement that there has to be policy priorities, even from the national level, that recognize and support what cities can do at the local level. But when we created this agenda, we recognized that a locus for innovation, a locus for progress, and really a locus for data as well was going to be at the city level. And cities, I think, as we've been working on sort of implementation of the SDGs over the past couple of years, you can really see cities as the places where interesting partnerships and interesting collaborators come together in new and creative ways to take on a particular issue and start to drive progress on that issue. And using cities as a network that sometimes, frankly, can get around the difficult policy and, national interest agenda that makes it difficult to basically share knowledge and share models back and forth. Cities are very pragmatic. They want to get things done, as we've mentioned countless times already, and being able to learn from each other and adapt models and replicate those models and take them to scale. I think we're seeing a proliferation of networks to be able to do that, but also then to drive what the policy priorities are and what the policy solutions ought to be. The interesting thing is that the Sustainable Development Goals now from a global perspective, and it's great to see the hands in this room, but I will say across the US, the level of familiarity is generally much lower. But from a global perspective, it really is becoming what I call the sort of the common language and the DNA of development worldwide. It is a common agenda that everyone can understand and see themselves reflected in, and sort of also connect. Well, I'm doing this fits within these 2 or 3 goals. I understand exactly where that is, and we're doing something to do a priority on that. It is also something that, frankly, allows you to engage with external stakeholders. Business, and even U.S. business, has really embraced the goals as a platform and as a way of thinking and a mindset. You actually have CalPERS, the California Pension Fund, undertaking an analysis internally to see how their investments map against the Sustainable Development Goals. And investors and companies are using it as a way, because again, they find it a common language, a common framework that everyone can understand and sort of have a certain standard basis from. So I think it really provides an opportunity for U.S. cities, which are sometimes in the vanguard of really interesting partnerships and interesting progress, to be able to promote both what they're doing at home for their own citizens, but also drive a policy agenda internationally.
Jaana, please.
Thank you, Jay. Really appreciate the invitation from you and from CPD. Although I must say it didn't take much arm twisting for me, given that I have a son who is a sophomore at Viterbi. So we at the McKinsey Global Institute have studied cities globally for over 10 years now, really focusing on their role in the global economy. And clearly our angle to that is business and economics. So that's the angle to which I'm going to come to the diplomacy question. And what I'd like to do just in the opening is to give you a sense of why we think it matters for cities to have a diplomatic mission, and second, a particularly economic one, and perhaps some thoughts based on our experience of how that might look slightly different as we look ahead. So first on why should cities do this? First of all, because they can. Cities collectively have a very heavy economic weight. We already heard about LA alone metropolitan area has an economy that's larger than Turkey's, Netherlands, or Saudi Arabia's. If you take all of the largest cities in the US, or let's just take the ones with 150,000 people or more in the metro area, they represent 10% of global GDP. That's a lot of economic power that you can move around if you like. And I think many times cities haven't really used that. And let me tell you why that matters for many topics that we care about. Think of California in the 1970s. We really took a very dramatic action on energy efficiency. We really put targets for not just cars, but for refrigerators. And because California is such a large market, most companies made those machines for California, but sold them everywhere. So that just shifted not just California's energy consumption, but the world's. This is something that's an option for many of the topics cities are looking at today. The time is also one ripe for cities to play a role. When we look across industries, the next wave of digitization, the next wave of smart cities, if you want, whatever your favorite catchword is actually changing most industries and most cities in the next few decades. And it really is important for cities to play a role. This is, you don't want to be bystanders because it's going to shape cities in many ways. So it's an urgent demand to play a role in this economic sphere. That's difficult and hard for everyone, but my third reason is I really hope cities will do it because you have a very unique vantage point to that. You are the closest to the citizens and you are pragmatic. I like that a lot from Tony. This is not an ideological discussion. We are all about how do we make the next wave of technology work for our citizens, first work for our cities, work for our businesses. And I think that focus on pragmatism, on getting things done, I think is a very useful tool to get through some of the more ideological discussions or some of the disagreements that might come up elsewhere. So those are the reasons why we think there's a lot of value for cities to be involved. Then about the how. I think in the economic in the economic diplomacy sphere, traditionally it has a lot been about economic development. It's about attracting FDI. It's about attracting companies to your area. And I think that is clearly probably going to stay. I think we have seen a frenzy for some headquarters recently that certainly suggests that it's not gone anywhere. However, I think if you think of these protocols of shaping the next wave of cities' growth, I think there's a few ways in which this might be different. First of all, the power is really shifting from the companies that many of us were thinking about them as the ones we need to attract to the cities, because now companies want to sell to you. So think about the smart cities debate. It really started from the private sector companies pushing for a lot of solutions. I think we have now kind of learned that a lot of those promises may be a little optimistic, and we are much more focused on proven facts on what works and what doesn't. And I'd just like to shout out to our colleagues from Boston. I really like, for example, seeing the Boston Smart City Playbook, where they say, we really don't, there was 5 little things. I recommend you have a look at it, because they say, for example, platforms make us go, very much saying, solve my problems, talk to my citizens, tell me how you are going to help me, but don't come and tell me why your technology is the best one. So I was thinking that is exactly the kind of attitude cities could adopt in this next phase of diplomacy, of saying what we want to do and why. The second factor that is changing is that it is less competitive with other cities. Oftentimes we were competing, sometimes even just the neighbor city that wasn't very far away for the investment that was coming in. But I think in this next phase, there is a lot of benefits of collaborating. And the more weight you have behind of saying, well, we all want this kind of a product to solve our, whether it's traffic or seismic systems or something else, and this is really important for all of us, that is going to help you get what you want. So the third point is that when you know what you want, and the power is yours and not the cities, and you work with other cities around the globe, you are much more likely to shape exactly what you want the outcome for your city to be. And from that reason, from that perspective purely, we at the McKinsey Global Institute would actually love to see cities play a bigger, more proactive role, because of the fact that I think it would be good for many of the outcomes that we will see. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for both panelists, their perspectives geographically, but also on a variety of policy matters. I wanted to actually follow up on what Jaana was talking about. You know, you're basically looking to the future, but this is what, you know, our topic of the day is the future of city diplomacy. As we look at cities' international relations in the international policy context, I would like the panelists to say a little bit more. Where can city push the envelope on the international policy side of it? Because we've heard sustainable development goals, and I think many cities in the U.S. are very much involved and engaged in the immigration debates. But looking ahead, in 5 years or 10 years' time, what other international policy issues or arenas that cities can really make a difference? Anybody want to take on this?
It's a good question, and actually, Jaana made me think of one potential solution to that is like the future of mobility, you know, which is something our mayor is really interested in. New transportation options that are sustainable and shared and efficient. So it's something that LA is thinking a lot about, but we certainly can learn from other cities and how to do that. And then there's Hyperloop that wants to connect cities. So I think cities will have a pretty big role in that conversation. I've been trying to think about what are the ingredients of a policy issue where cities can make a difference. And there's probably academics in the audience who've got this already down, but I just was thinking about it yesterday. So I think you have to have the levers of a certain policy be in a city. So cities, the reason climate is such a powerful one for cities is that we have utilities, and we provide power, and we have infrastructure, and so we actually have a huge and we have lots of emissions, so we have a lot of weight in that discussion. The challenge can be transborder in nature, although I don't think you always have. I think that doesn't always have to be the case, but that can be the case. And that national governments don't have a singular jurisdiction over that issue. So those are, I would just offer as ingredients for looking at policy issues.
I would say right now also, looking 5 years on, I think it's really important to use the global goals as an organizing tool in terms of the language we use. We also, and I think, all of our cities are challenged with affordable housing, issues related to homelessness, and how are we sharing best practices both among ourselves here in the U.S., but also internationally. And Nina just mentioned the power the role that cities can have in climate action. New York City was aware that the Trump administration was likely going to pull out of the Paris Accords. I believe we were the first, if not one of the first cities that committed to the Paris Accords. And now I think there are about 400 U.S. cities that have committed to the Paris Accords. But there is a way for cities to stand up as a federal government steps back. And we can also go further. New York City is divesting our pensions from the big oil companies. And now we have Paris City Council and the London mayor interested in doing the same thing. So there can be the circle of sharing best practices and aligning ourselves where we can be a powerful unit if this coalition coalition of cities can find ways to go to do that together. And while there are so many different ways where we can think about 5 to 10 years, what are the issues we can take on, I do think it's really important for us to align ourselves with a common language. Otherwise, we're going to all be going in different ways and won't have that collective power. And, you know, I am uniquely seated in New York City, and we're the host to the UN, but the global goals and the power of all of these communities around the world taking on these challenges just feels like an opportunity that would be, you know, would really be a shame if we missed.
So you understand why I came, and it's not just for the weather, USC, but it's wonderful both to hear the reaffirmation of the potential importance of the global goals, but also even what they just said. So mobility is part of the city's goal, affordable housing as well. You know, climate change obviously is really part of the goals, and it does provide a common basis and a common language and a commonality in which to drive progress together. So it's to deliver for your citizens, but then also how that can drive global progress. So to Jay's question, what's interesting to me too is one of the revolutionary things about the Sustainable Development Goals was that it was the first time on a global basis where we had agreement that peace, justice, and security was a key building block for development. And so when you look at the SDGs and you look at Goal 16, that's really the first time where it was not just said this is a means to an end, but this is an important end in and of itself. And some of the key targets under that, just the first couple of targets are, you know, significantly reduce violence and end abuse, trafficking, and other violence towards children. Those are particular things, for example, that cities are doing, they're worried about. You know, we were having a conversation this morning, somebody was talking about, you know, gang violence and programs that are underway on that. And I actually think, so when I look at all those networks of cities that are out there, there's a lot on the environmental side and a lot on the economic growth and viability side. And I actually think cities have an awful lot to offer on the violence and conflict side, and conflict resolution, actually. Even cultural and historical legacies and what cities have been able to do to bring communities and bridge divides. I think there's an awful lot there to offer, and actually I think it would do the world well to be able to be working together on those issues and in the way in which cities are making progress within their own boundaries.
There's just a two-finger on that. There's a network for that. It's called the Strong City Network, and it's all about inclusive security. And so it's around violent extremism, but all kinds of violence, and how, you know, addressing violence in general has a lot of similarities, no matter what the source of the violence is. And LA has had some cutting-edge and very successful policies along those lines.
Jaana, you want to? Yeah.
Just very complementary to what you were saying, I think there also is a role for cities to be very proactive on the technical diplomacy. So issues like seismic security, cybersecurity, even things like open data. If all cities say that in order for you to be able to do something in my city, we want these conditions to be held, I think you actually could help set some future direction on big questions where there is clearly no agreement right now. And frankly, many of the companies don't really know where to head. So just saying, they don't really care even which way we are going in some cases. They just want to know the direction so that they can all plow to the same direction. So I think that is one area which is a challenge on one hand, because they are very technical oftentimes. And most cities that have limited resources don't have the capacity to extend that kind of capabilities in all directions. So the idea of being very strategic on which ones are the ones where your city is going to play a role, and take advantage of all of those networks and put your weight into that pool so that you can benefit from the collective power might be a way to go.
So for average citizens, this all sounds great, but this all sounds so ambitious and aspirational. Can we deliver this? So how can cities deliver on these goals and engage effectively globally to shape global conversations on some of these critical policy matters going forward? What are the skills? So what are the skills and capabilities that are required for cities to be effective in this regard? Because cities are not structured, organized, traditionally, right, towards these type of goals and objectives. So, yeah.
So the one thing I've heard in my last 24 hours with our colleagues here at USC is apparently you have to be optimistic. And that is a good skill to bring to the game. It was the task that Mayor de Blasio and I had in terms of creating this global platform. It was how we chose to use the resources we have. And something that I've heard from my colleagues from different cities today is that everybody has a different pool of resources, right? It could be just one person. It could be up to 4 or 5. It could be, at the end of the day, the numbers aren't significant. But what we do have is the power of partnership. And that is something that I can speak to. I remember when the mayor appointed me, he said, listen, I can give you, the title of commissioner, you get to represent New York City, and good luck. And that's where being an entrepreneur and figuring out a startup has actually been very important. And I think the way that all of us agree that we punch above our weight and be able to get things done is by working together. And I think it's not just city to city, it's not city to state, it's also how are we engaging other city agency partners, how are we engaging the community? Again, I talked about our Junior Ambassador program, but we have young people now learning about the global goals, doing something in their community, but going home and talking to their parents about it for the first time, right? And so it is how we're doing that, but also the private sector, absolutely critical in terms of partnership, not only for the economic development aspect of it, but how are we pushing common policies that we care about, whether it's around climate change or affordable housing. So I would just offer optimism around what partnership and collaboration can achieve, and then doing the hard work and the groundwork around building those networks, whether they're city or private sector or public.
And just to build on that, I think the skill involved in that is inspiring people to do things without having authority over them. So bringing partners together and saying, this is good for all of us if we do this, and it's good for citizens in this city.
Pure diplomacy.
Yeah, pure diplomacy, exactly. And I think that the global goals are useful for this too, because you can coalesce a group around an individual goal and find that there's a private sector piece to it, there's a education piece to it. And all of us in our cities have institutions that have their own global agenda, whether it's university or corporate headquarters or nonprofits. And so bringing them all together to discuss what our common agenda is, I think, is the way to go.
I think just a two-finger on that, storytelling is exceptionally important. And it's both city identity and city history and what is unique about the place that you call home, but then also telling that story and what the relevance is to the world at large globally. And so, and in some respects, the goals or other things, help you tell that story as well in a way that's understandable in a common language. I think the other thing I would say is being data-driven. And using evidence both to track progress and then make course corrections, but also show what you're delivering for your citizens, and holding yourselves accountable for that as well. And doing that well requires, again, breaking down lots of silos across many different. It's the partnership model that Penny was just talking about, because you really have to be in partnership with lots of different places within both city government and then lots of external partners as well.
On the skills, I think as we have looked at some of even the national diplomacy change a little bit from the more traditional policy perspective or international relations perspective to economics, the profile of the folks who did that work very well often varied, because to do economic diplomacy in the traditional sense, I would say, of going and attracting businesses is a very different skill. You need to understand the customer, you need to know what they do and have something very, very specific to them. And oftentimes, a lot of it is just really making them feel very special. So I'll give you my favorite example. A CEO who was considering relocating their headquarters told me that the third person calling him after his child was born was the mayor of Chicago, who was trying to recruit them to relocate there. And he said, I still can't figure out how he knew. And it just tells you that it is a very different skill that you would have for someone, for example, if you're working on the climate change and setting the standards, where you actually need to have the technical expertise. And simply, I think, having the title and the academic experience makes you credible. So I think there is no one right answer. As always, I mean, this is a diverse diplomatic team is better than one that's perfect in one direction.
So on a diplomacy question, this is my last question, and we'll open up to the audience. What kind of resource does diplomacy bring to this endeavor? I mean, Nina and Tony, both of you have worked at the federal level. How is that? Yeah.
I mean, diplomacy is a resource. I mean, it is the way in which, I mean, it encompasses all that connection building and partnership building and, knowing to call somebody after their baby is born, but also, welcoming people. I mean, you can't get any of this done without diplomacy. I mean, I think mayors themselves can't really, it's applied to the local level. Even if you don't have an internationally minded mayor, still all those skills, that's diplomacy. That's getting along with others and putting yourself in their shoes and thinking about what their perspective is and where's the common ground. I mean, that's what, many of us do every day just in our everyday relationships as well.
It's interesting too, because when you think about it at the nation state level, a lot of what diplomacy is about avoiding, mitigating, or not getting into conflict, or sort of finding some resolution to particular conflict. And that conflict can turn physical. I mean, you're talking, 54 or 55% of our discretionary budget is defense. And when you're talking about city diplomacy, it's about pragmatism. It's a positive agenda. It's about, pragmatic, it's about development, it's about communities and people thriving, and in your environment being sustainable so that future generations will be able to thrive as well. And it's about that economic growth that benefits as many people as possible within your borders. And I think that's really interesting to think about how you apply, some of the diplomatic skills and tools that in a different lens in a very positive way. And I think that's in some respects why you've seen the explosion of cities working together to be able to sort of collectively take an agenda together forward, because they're able to do it for their citizens, and then it also adds to progress on the global stage as well.
Okay, great. Questions from the audience? Yes, we have 2 mics.
Thanks. Yeah, I am interested in the kind of contentiousness of politics at the federal level. At the moment, the President and the Attorney General are interested in withholding funds to certain cities in this country due to sanctuary policies. And I wonder if you could comment on whether there might be other areas where you're likely to see the federal government sort of acting as an obstacle. I'm thinking particularly in the environmental area and climate change. It would certainly be ironic if Scott Pruitt were starting to sue cities for having stricter standards than the federal level. So I just wonder if you could talk about that and whether that's a sort of another angle on this issue that's opening up. Thank you.
I mean, I would say it's fair to say that New York City is a target on a number of different issues. So I am optimistic, and one of the ways that I have viewed the Trump administration of the last year and a half is as an opportunity for not only Americans, but for our international counterparts to recognize the power of cities and states in our American federalist system. And that has been a very powerful I think, opportunity for cities to show up and lead. And I will say, there are absolute realities that the federal government, I know with New York City, can perhaps withhold funding around our Department of Education, which our NYCHA, which is our housing program. There are a number of things that they can withhold funding, and the city and the mayor have been very strategic about ensuring that there has been a surplus in budget in case they do that. That being said, Jeff Sessions, as an example, doesn't believe in community policing, was very angry about the fact that New York City stopped our stop and frisk program. And at the end of the day, they can't force the mayor to reverse those policies with the NYPD. And that is a really important, I think, point of pride for us, is to say that over the last 4 years, we focused on community policing. We got rid of stop and frisk, and New York City hasn't been safer in decades. And that is a real place for us to say, these are how our policies are working, and this is the leadership that we get to have at the city level. So yes, they can threaten to underfund or defund certain areas, but there is so much power that our cities and states have in terms of controlling how we do everything from policing to affordable housing to climate action. And I think this has just been a really great opportunity to highlight that in the last year and a half.
Okay, thanks. Nick?
Thanks, Jay. What I wanted to ask about is the way in which cities are connecting with one another to create alternative networks. And you mentioned the Strong Cities Network, and we're really proud here that one of the architects of that at the State Department was a graduate of our public diplomacy program. So that's especially nice to hear it coming back, the idea coming back to his school. But I was interested in whether the Global Parliament of Mayors is something that you see a future in. Is this something that you are participating in, or do you feel that rather than having a central meeting point for mayors and for city diplomats, it's better to partner around single issues like the strong cities or the networks around climate? So if you could talk a little bit about, rather than the unilateral stuff, where multilateral city fora are emerging. Thanks very much.
Well, that's interesting. I don't know a lot about that organization yet. There are certain parts of our city bureaucracy that have dealt with the global parliament more than I have, but it's on my very long to-do list. But what's interesting is that there's the U.S. Conference of Mayors, and so those are just mayors getting together, and then there are subcommittees and specific agenda items that they push depending on the meeting. And so I can imagine, a global parliament of mayors doing, following a similar model where it's around a particular issue. That makes it easier in a way to prep the person, right? Because you have the subject matter experts who are the ones who know all the technical details, and a lot of what we deal with is highly technical. So I think that's I guess my question would be whether these other city networks that are getting stronger, what are the subject areas where the global parliament could play a particular role that isn't yet being covered, and there are plenty of them.
Clay?
Yes. Thanks for the conference. Congratulations to the center for this workshop and for this public session. And I've taken a lot away just from our panelists. One about you have to think long term, because many of these challenges are going to exist beyond the term of any mayor, any city council, any of those sorts of things. You have to be optimistic. And one of the things that came especially from the two city representatives is the subject of mobilization. It's not enough, we're talking about city diplomacy as though it's all about the other, but often it's about us mobilizing internally. So in the school outreaches and things like that, I was really impressed by. But to pick up on what Nick just asked, with regard to specific kinds of things, and Jaana emphasized the technical, Tony emphasized the pragmatic, very issue-focused. And so my question is, if our panel can point to something very specific of your best practice, but not from LA and not from New York, maybe from Charlotte, maybe from somewhere else. And so if any of the panelists could highlight that kind of issue-oriented collaboration that exists.
So this involves New York City, but another city. So something that I have been thinking a lot about since the time that Jay and Nina approached me about this conversation about the future of city diplomacy is how do we measure success? of what it means to be engaging in city diplomacy. And something that has struck me is how we're able to exchange best practices and then see it manifest. So one of the priorities for New York City and early for Mayor de Blasio was our IDNYC program. This is to ensure that all New Yorkers, irrespective of their documentation status, had access to an ID card that allowed them to navigate New York City in a dignified fashion. You need an ID card to access city services, to pick up your kids from school. So that has been a priority of New York City and of this administration. Then we are in touch and are actively working with the Paris mayor around a number of different issues, but then the Charlie Hebdo attacks happened. The mayor and I went in solidarity soon after, and a conversation that Mayor Hidalgo and Mayor de Blasio really got into is how do you make certain communities that feel disconnected feel more part of the core of Paris. And one of the ideas that he shared with her was IDNYC. That her team on immigration worked with ours, and within a year they implemented their version of IDNYC. And to me, that is a successful manifestation of city diplomacy and that exchanging of best practices.
Clay, by the way, so the discussion we had this morning, and also after this public program that involving the cities across the country, I believe there are best practices from that discussion, and we'll be putting together a summary report, and we'll share very soon. Yeah, thanks. Yes, please. Oh, I'm sorry. Yes.
Hi, thank you all for coming. I'm Hachigian. Anthony was saying data is obviously very important to kind of see how you go forward and how you learn from going forward. And my question is, I guess, how do you standardize data across all of these cities and figure out who's doing the best and to address those sustainability development goals?
Yeah, how do we? What do you think, guys?
We're figuring it out.
That's our afternoon session.
So that is a challenge. And there is an official architecture for how progress is going to be measured at the national and global level on the Sustainable Development Goals. And there are those who would say, we need to get, even at the city level, cities reporting data in the same way so we compare across apples to apples across different cities. And I think to the extent to which we can do that we should. I mean, and that comes back to sort of technical leadership. But at the same time, not every city is collecting data in exactly the same way. There's a lot of legacy in how data gets collected. Typically, it started because of a particular program that was funded or something happened around that. And now you want to use that data for maybe something that's slightly different, and it's hard to do. I'm of the idea, and I think this is what I feel like New York did with their plan, is to say, okay, we have a set of priorities. So first off, out of the 17 goals and 169 targets, you do want to be making progress on all of those, but you're going to put more attention to a set of priorities within that makes sense for your own city's context and for where you are as a city. And there's a political context, there's good reasons for doing that. And so you're going to set your set of priorities out of those goals. And then to the extent possible, I think it's really important to align against the global agenda and to align, to the extent possible, the data that will feed into that. Now, the way the architecture is set up, it's not like cities are reporting to the federal government and then they're reporting to the global goals and through the UN. It's the U.S. statistical offices. It's the chief statistician at the Office of Management and Budget, and they work with like 21 different agencies across the U.S. government that have their own statistical agencies, and that's the data they're going to draw from to say how well the U.S. is doing on progress. Having said that, a lot of that data comes from different jurisdictions and is collected in partnership with cities and states and others. I think we risk making the perfect the enemy of the good. I also think it's a place where universities and civil society and nonprofits and philanthropies can play a really important role because they can help harmonize data across and don't want to have to put it all on the city to be able to do that. And I think those types of partnerships are going to be very important over the next few years as we really get and dig deep into the agenda. And there are, there are going to be lots of third-party indices that try to do this and make this as robust a reporting as possible as well. I think at the end of the day, though, I fear, and it'd be interesting to hear, my city colleagues talk about this, but you don't want to make it a reporting requirement that isn't worth it, because then you create a disincentive for cities to want to adopt this and use it as a way to drive their own progress. And so there's a real balance between getting the data you need, being data-driven, and having that data be comparable from city to city at the same time as going overboard and just making it too difficult and then sort of creating the disincentive not to make progress on that.
I would love to jump at this because I love your question. It's one of my pet peeves as someone who, for the last 10 years, have actually spent a lot of time trying to get data at the city level. And this actually was one thing that came from the private sector. It was, do you remember the time when people talked about globalizing and moving to China and India in the 2000s? Companies didn't have the data of any of the specific cities, just about anywhere outside of US and Western Europe. And it was the private companies that started tracking different kinds of data, us included. We were the first ones to generate a global database of all metro areas and their GDP, so we could even know what share of global GDP came from cities. Siemens started their green cities indices, etc. There was huge investments from the private sector to try to do exactly that. Also some nonprofits, the World Bank through their effort on the ground. The challenge was that we put huge amounts of efforts into a problem that everyone agrees is very large, but they were uncoordinated. A lot of them came from the private sector where when the leadership and priorities changed, those didn't continue. And in a way, that is, if I had one wish of, as an economist, I mean, I have many wishes, but as an economist, if I had one wish of a problem to solve that I think would be a platform for real change, it would be this. It's not an easy solution to do bottom-up, because we don't even agree on how to define a city. I mean, you may track different LA metrics than I do as the metropolitan area, or someone else who is doing the transport system that has a different district. There need to be someone who coordinates them, because otherwise it's impossible to do afterwards. And many smart people have tried. So that is something that I know it's not easy. I wish it would change. But if we get the data, things will start to change. Let me give you 2 examples. OECD's PISA metrics, far from perfect, far from perfect. I think we could find so many things to pick on them. Yet they have been a catalyst for research on what is effective on education, and it has really led to real changes in what education departments do, because they can tell how they are doing compared to others. Another one, how to do business in World Bank. It's definitely not perfect either. Yet, I think it has been a very effective tool for many cities to try to figure out, many countries and cities to try to figure, okay, actually these are things I can act on. I can reduce time it takes to get a paperwork done. So, I mean, sorry, really love your question, and I think this is something where actually some kind of multilateral diplomacy could make it a priority for UN or for someone else to put all the money into the same pool.
Yeah, the interesting thing is the SDGs, when we adopted them, called for a data revolution. And so at least put the attention out there on the need for data. But unfortunately, the investment, I just don't think has really being unleashed yet. There are going to be a lot of third-party efforts, which I think are going to provide some insights, but in the multilateral coordinated way in which you're saying, we're just not getting the amount of dollars and the investments that you would need to really do that.
I just want to say, too, that it also, what you have to begin with is a mindset toward open data, which in and of itself, for some cities, is a real lift. And I know our mayor spent a lot of time on this, and we now are, win awards regularly for the best city for data and innovation. But it was a while getting there to explain to departments that this is actually for you. These tools are for you. You publish this, and then others can take a look and help drive solutions conversations, and we've managed to make progress on a lot of sticky challenges because we finally had the data and it was open to everybody. But it takes a while to get there.
Okay, thank you for your patience.
Hello, my name is Renato Balbin. I'm from Brazil. In Brazil, I work at the federal level, and talking a little bit about metrics and data, that makes me think about the new urban agenda. In Brazil, I coordinated this process as you coordinated the SDG here. And then that's my first, it's not a question, it's to maybe to listen a little bit. The position, if you, Anthony in particular, could give me an idea of the position of United States about the new urban agenda, talking about metrics, how these metrics could be developed, how these metrics, they are in this process to be developed with the new urban agenda in relation with the SDGs. But as we know, United States, for example, didn't support the SDG 11 goal, and also didn't support very well the new urban agenda, in particular the subject, the right to the city. And getting this subject, I would like to talk also with the two representatives of cities. At the end of the day, a city is just our home, no? We don't come back from job to the nation, to the state. We come back to the job from the city, and sometimes this city is not LA or New York. It's just a peripheral city, no? Usually, we talk about these global cities, talking about the metropolis. You know? We are not really talking about the city. And then we have a huge problem between the relation between these cities, the peripheral cities, and the metropolis. 2 years ago, I was at the CGLU, talking about in a situation like that. So then I would like to ask you if these two cities, LA and New York, if you guys have some strategy to work with the cities of the metropolis, and also some strategy to work with the identity of people, not just to improve the commerce, the business, and everything. Thank you.
I can just answer that second part a little bit, which is that there's 88 cities in LA County, and this our mayor has taken a very regional approach, which not all mayors do, but he regularly meets with them all. I think he might be the first mayor to do that on a regular basis, and also they were just in Sacramento yesterday, the big 11 city mayors. So there's that network as well. So I think part of it is just a mindset of listening to other cities and listening to what their experience is, and then just having a cooperative framework, because it is the case that we are much stronger if we're all working together and not at odds with one another.
So on the new urban agenda, I'd say a couple of different things. One, the Habitat 3, where the new urban agenda was adopted, was at a really difficult time politically in the U.S. because it was right before our elections, and so there was a lot of attention that was being dispersed in other ways, and so even the delegation being put together and going down. I will say I think that we had a very strong and robust sort of civil society, private sector engagement in that agenda and inputs into it, universities as well. And I think for city experts in the U.S., I think those who know about it would see a lot reflected there that they would be supportive of. I think the other thing is that also internally for the U.S. government, similar to cities and to the limited capacity sometimes cities have to engage internationally, Housing and Urban Development, for example, in the U.S. government had a very small international affairs office, and also so being able to robustly engage sort of in an agenda that was specifically about cities, we didn't have as much capacity, so to speak, during a time where politically there was a lot going on. But I think in terms of substance, I think there's a lot of those city experts and people who believe in cities that really support around, that provide a lot of support around the policy of the New Urban Agenda.
Okay, so Sherry, you have the last question. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you. My name is Sherry Dolai Shahi. I actually have a question specific to Brookings. I know that with Brookings Global Cities Initiative, and our city, San Antonio, has been involved from the very beginning in the first part, which was focusing on the trade and investment strategies, and now on the market prioritization efforts. But it's all obviously very much focused on the economic angle. As I listen to the discourse on the need to standardize, the need to capture data, the need to kind of create a platform where everyone can capture consistent data, what role can the Brookings play into expanding Global Cities Initiative into the future to really encompass public diplomacy, specifically as a tool and not with economic development as an ends?
So I think the Sustainable Development Goals are the entry point for that, frankly, and like any institution, we have our silos at Brookings. And the Global Cities Initiative is within the Metropolitan Program, which works directly with cities on city-specific issues and helping them make progress on those. We've had some initial conversations with those of us in global economy and development who come at the Sustainable Development Goals, which are successors to the Millennium Development Goals, and the experience we've had on that. And we've actually had a couple of initial conversations about metrics specifically and about indices that might make sense to go beyond that. We haven't had the conversation that we're having right here about city diplomacy. So it's a great thing for me to take back to my colleagues and start to have those conversations. Because I think it is interesting. And you know, again, there's a lot of network. Those of you who are from cities here, you know how many networks there are out there that are specific to cities and specific to particular issues. I would be loath to sort of just start another network, but at the same time, to integrate a lot of what we're talking about here today could be really useful. And so we'll have to put some thought into that.
Okay, this concludes our event, and thank you so much for coming, and please join me thanking our expert panel.